The story of Pokemon has been told time and time again, but in my humble opinion it has always focused too much on the titular characters. The story of the man who created Pokemon has often been infantilized and simplified to bug-loving boy creates the hit video game of all time, and to an extent that is true, but there's more to it than that. My interest in Japanese books detailing early video game history was spurred after reading Hobonichi's tender look at the life of Satoru Iwata, Nintendo's former president, the late Satoru Iwata. I wanted to know more about the figures whose achievements have contributed to the image of the Japanese video game industry as the titans of creativity. And so I learned of the existence of a book called Pokemon'o wo創った男, which very roughly means the man who made Pokemon. Upon my first reading, I was blown away. I never imagined that the story of the man who made Pokemon would be set against such a rich backdrop of subculture and include mentions of John Waters or the Amshin Rikyo cult. And I never imagined Tajiri as the passionate, out-to-show-the-world personality that he seems to be. He had always been portrayed as an almost cherubic, innocent youth that loved bugs and just happened to make the hit video game of all time. What I think is left out is the mention of the nuances of Tajiri's thoughts and feelings about the creative process, and also his growth as a creative and a business person. Tajiri was more than just a bug boy, and Pokemon was more than just a phenomenon. So let me get this straight right to begin with. This is not the story of Pokemon. This is the story of the man who created pocket monsters, Tajiri Satoshi. So this edition of the book was actually published in 2009. However, it is actually comprised of a bunch of interviews from around 2002, around the time of Ruby and Sapphire's development, which then were first published as a standalone book in 2004. There is a biography in manga form with the same name, which is completely different, so if you search for this book, keep that in mind. This book, however, is a dialogue between the interviewer Miya Shotaro and Tajiri Satoshi. However, there are some appealing additional sections in the form of a thorough appendix, providing information on people and subjects touched on during their dialogue, a copy of a reprint of the first issue of Game Freak magazine, and some Pocket Monsters design documents and illustrations. Even at the time of these interviews, Tajiri had already started taking a back seat in development, with Masuda Junichi taking over the director role for the Ruby and Sapphire games. Tajiri wasn't very public-facing or easily accessible, which he partly attributes to the Pokemon anime seizure incident. The interviewer, Miya Shotaro, notes a nervousness and excitement about being able to talk with him. The book covers the main stages of Tajiri's life up until that point. Born in 1965 in the Setagawa ward of Tokyo, Tajiri's parents would move into government housing after winning the lottery, which was a part of the selection process. Tajiri would grow up in a town called Machida, which was on the outskirts of Tokyo at the time. Tajiri calls it Tokyo's appendix several times throughout the book, and notes it was a time of rapid development towards the state of suburbia. When they had first arrived there, it was abundant with nature. The meadows and marshlands were untouched by human hand. However, Tajiri would grow up in parallel with an enormous effort to develop the area. One year there would be bulldozers, plots of land the next, and the following year there would be houses. Tajiri notes that this 3-year period was very impactful on him. Because of Machida's location, he was able to experience a childhood similar to that of a child of the 1950s, rather than the 1960s or 70s. He would play Menko with other children and draw on the ground with chalk-like stone. He caught crayfish by sticking his arm into the mud, and beetles by strategically placing rocks for them to shelter under during the day. Eventually, the mountains where he had done this were dynamited, and he found himself going weekly to collect fossil-like seashells. By 1978, the wilderness's transformation would be complete. Fields and thickets became homes, and fishing ponds became the early arcades. It was at this time that Tajiri's interests changed from playing outdoors to frequenting the arcades. Tajiri first went to the arcades with a friend whose parents both worked, so he had a bit of extra pocket money. He first watched his friend play and found himself thinking that as there was no chance of a return, that it was a waste of money. Eventually, Tajiri got the chance to play, and he remembers vaguely feeling that he had got his money's worth. Tajiri Satoshi loved the arcades. He was absolutely enamored with them, so much so that in 1990, just a few years before the original Pocket Monsters, he released a book called Catcher in Pac-Land about his experiences in the arcades growing up. Tajiri and the interviewer remark that the early arcades had a more chaotic feeling to them, something that they feel that the kids who now play Pokemon and don't go to arcades couldn't understand. Tajiri saw the identity of the early arcades change as amusement laws were brought into place which limited their opening hours, and they started to become more well-lit and welcoming to the average person. In his experience, up until then, arcades had been shady places that you wouldn't tell your parents about going to. Later, he saw the identity shift again after the release of home consoles, seeing arcades shift to be more crane games and versus games like Street Fighter. But in the early days, around about the first year of middle school, Tajiri frequented the arcades. He remarks that at the time, even if my parents collapsed or my teachers would chase me, I would still go to the arcades. His first main love was Space Invaders and its many variations. He would devise ways to scrounge up money that he could sink into the arcades. He would tell his parents that he needed textbooks, or he would skip taking the bus and walk to cram school, just to save the bus fare. And even if he had no money himself, Tajiri would go there to watch others play, while he drank some cola. This particular arcade didn't have the funds to have the official Taito machines like others, so instead it housed some of the many bootlegs. The company Sanritsu would run location tests here to gauge how games were received and then make changes. This was the first time that Tajiri encountered such a concept. At this time, Tajiri says he thought about games for about 3/4 of the day, or for about as long as he was awake. When he saw an advertisement for a game idea contest, he thought that it was his chance to break into the industry with a game idea of his own. He sent 2 ideas. One where you could open and close an umbrella to avoid the rain, and a second one where the screen was black except for when crows would open their eyes, which you could then shoot. To his disappointment, he received no great acclaim, receiving only 2 keychains in the mail as a token of participation. However, about a year later, the video game company Sega would also hold its own competition. The prize was 1,000,000 yen, or very roughly about $10,000. This time, Tajiri focused on one idea, although notes that at the time he was still spending more time at the arcades than on his idea. Close to the deadline, he put a submission together of about 4 pages and sent it off. He didn't hear anything back for more than half a year. Just when he was starting to forget about it, he received a call telling him that he had won an award of excellence. There had been no grand prize winner, however he and one other boy had shared the top spot. Tajiri's subsequent trip to Sega was the first time he had ever stepped foot in a video game company. This was around the first year of high school. The idea that Tajiri had won with was a game called Spring Stranger, with a character who, in his words, looked like a cute camel cricket. The character could jump very high, and Tajiri remarks that when he later saw Qbert, he thought that it looked like his character. Having won a lesser 100,000 yen, or about $1,000 very roughly, this helped Tajiri's parents understand that his video game obsession wasn't going to bring him to ruin. He gave them half, in hopes that they would stop seeing his trips to the arcade as delinquency. Unfortunately, however, Tajiri's game was ever only half developed and never saw the light of day. The other boy's idea would become Super Locomotive, hitting the arcades in 1982 and featuring Yellow Magic Orchestra's Ride-In as its soundtrack. Tajiri continued to haunt the arcades. He would go to play Space Invaders, only to realize it was a bootleg. He was fascinated by these many variations. He says that at the time he didn't realize that these variations came from old dudes who were handy with soldering irons. He didn't view these bootlegs as fakes, but rather a world he wanted to know more about. He said that to him, there were about 50 variations of Space Invaders. In the book, he laments that these lesser variations have fallen into obscure history, and remarks towards the end of the book that were Taito to release a 25th anniversary collection, he would want them to somehow come together with other companies and release all the variations as one package. When I read this, I thought of the many Pokemon ROM hacks and thought Tajiri must be proud. And so in many ways it could be said that without Space Invaders we would have no Pokemon. Tajiri says that the inspiration for the first Game Freak magazine came from a Space Invaders strategy book, roughly called Invader Strategy Book, With this, you too can be a 10,000 point player. The motivation, however, came from the fact that Tajiri didn't have anyone in his close circle that he could talk about video games with. From his time in the arcades, he picked up many tips and tricks, which he felt that made the experience of playing video games richer, if you knew them. You see, Tajiri had always had a curious nature, a thirst for knowledge, and a passion for the sciences. He remarks that he had always had the stance of whatever you research yourself becomes your own knowledge. This was fostered by his elementary school teacher, who ran classes in such a way that the students would do their own research, come to school, give reports on the topic, and then the teacher would supplement the information that they had missed. The students giving the presentation would use their gariban to create handouts for the class, and Tajiri says that this became habitual. It's not too hard to see the connection to making a zine about video games. Only those students who wanted to had to do the reports, but Tajiri found himself staying up late every night working on his report for the next day. At the same time, listening to foreign radio had become a popular pastime. At first, Tajiri listened on his parents' vacuum tube radio. However, he later bought a Matsushita Proceed. You know Matsushita as Panasonic. Tajiri would listen to foreign radio stations, wanting to receive the verification cards that you could if you sent off reports, but sending these reports required money. So Tajiri found himself sending reports mostly to communist countries. Tajiri humorously notes that these companies mostly broadcast propaganda, so their service was very good. He even had his report read out on Moscow airwaves one time. One time he sent a report to North Korea, and they sent him back a small little flag and a registration number. This scared Tajiri, who thought that he might be kidnapped, likely due to the North Korean abductions of Japanese citizens at the time. Tajiri also played with what they called a denchi block and wanted to try his hand at making a radio. He thought that technology was a way to make the world more convenient. This is the reason Pokemon is a world where science has advanced quite a bit. I also got the impression while reading this book that this utopia-like world could possibly have come from Tajiri's contrarian tendencies, in opposition to the dark and broody media of the time which they discuss. But back to Game Freak magazine. So Tajiri's manic tendencies caused him to make a zine called Game Freak. The book recounts several times him getting dunked on for it being handwritten with poor drawings. At first, the zine consisted mostly of handwritten articles and crude pixel art. One such critic was Sugimori Ken, who had found the zine in a bookshop after tagging along with a friend. He wrote a letter to Tajiri saying that the drawings could be done a little bit better, which led to Tajiri bringing Sugimori on to do illustrations for the zine. In the book, Tajiri and Sugimori recount how at the time there just wasn't much information about video games. You had the instruction manual and catalogs that were aimed at industry people, which were hard to get for the average person. Tajiri even got punched in the head one time for trying to steal a poster off a wall. However, thanks to creating the Game Freak magazine, Tajiri found himself receiving plenty of information about games in the form of letters or phone calls. He received one letter from a group in Aichi Prefecture calling themselves Mystics and saying that if they had the hardware of a game, they could tell pretty much anything about it. At the time, there were plenty of rumors and secrets about games, and Tajiri's favorite, Xevious, was no exception. The popular Xevious rumors were as follows. There is a 1 in a million chance that a Galaxian will fly on screen. There is a 1 in a million chance that a Phantom Plane will fly on screen. One guy at one arcade said a dog appeared. Or another popular one was that if you shot things in a certain order, the player would be able to go to the planet Xevious. Namco's Masanobu Endo said that Tajiri was a bit of a nuisance in spreading these rumors. Tajiri was a little bit taken aback by this and actually sent a board of Xevious to the group Mystics to see what they could find out. They found that there was no planet to go to and that the Galaxian sprite was in the game data, but there was no code that would make it appear. Tajiri let it be known that he wasn't spreading rumors, that he just wanted to find out the truth. He notes that it would have been best to ask Namco directly, but that started to get into trade secrets. So at the time, gamers mostly relied on each other for information. Now, Tajiri considered himself knowledgeable about games, but found Sugimori mentioning games in his letters to him that he'd never even heard of. Sugimori was so knowledgeable about games as there was an arcade near his high school that was running location tests. Once Tajiri realized this, he started keeping track of these locations. The two would meet for the first time ever at Amusement Expo Japan. Tajiri remembers that it was around about the 20th annual expo, and Sugimori remembers them showing the arcade games Fozon and Pole Position 2, which both came out in 1983, so it was likely the 1982 or 1983 expo. Tajiri says that at the time it was still an event for industry people. He came to know about the event through his occasional visits to Sega after having won the video game idea contest. Someone at Sega had given him 2 tickets to the event. In a reply to Sugimori's letter, Tajiri put in one of the tickets to the event, telling Sugimori that he should come if he could. Sugimori had heard about the event in reports that he had read, but wasn't involved in the industry at all, so he never thought that he could go to what sounded like a dream event. So Sugimori did the natural thing, which was to skip school, rent a coin locker, and stuff his school uniform inside, going in different clothes. Given that it was around 1982, the pair didn't have a way to organize their meeting. The Dynatac 8000X, widely considered the first commercial mobile phone, only came out in 1983, so they didn't have any way to contact each other. Tajiri put on a name tag saying Game Freak and figured that if he walked around, they might bump into each other. Eventually, he heard a voice say, "Excuse me, are you Tajiri?" Sugimori had been going around to each of the booths and signing his name, because if you did that, you received a show bag with flyers and other things inside. When he had went to one, Tajiri had been the last name signed, so he realized that he must be close. He jokes that it's like when you touch the bed of someone who's just been sleeping there. It was still warm. And so that was how they met. The floor was filled with old men in suits, so a pair of school students walking around was a bit of a rare sight. The event at the time was nothing like the modern-day vibrant events for consumers and enthusiasts. It was mostly older people doing business, asking things like, "How many can I fit in my store and for how much?" But to Sugimori and Tajiri, it was a dreamland. They were able to witness the current power of the video game industry. Remember that the Famicom only released in 1983, so this was before home consoles were popularized. Being able to play for free was like heaven. Sugimori found himself pressing the insert credit button about 50 times, marveling at the dream of being able to play that much. A few years later, Sugimori would receive 100,000 yen for one of his works in Shonen Sunday. He would use this money to rent an apartment after a falling out with his parents. He says it was half them kicking him out and half him leaving of his own accord. Tajiri suggested that if Sugimori came to Machida, Tajiri could make sure that Sugimori didn't go hungry. Sugimori moved into an apartment nearby, and so it became that Tajiri frequented Sugimori's apartment. There, they would make Game Freak magazine and have constant discussions about video games. It was at this time that other members of Game Freak started joining. Sugimori's apartment became their makeshift headquarters. They say it felt like a club room at school. Tajiri and Sugimori would constantly talk about video games in the process of making issues of Game Freak magazine. They would discuss a game's weak and strong points, but that kind of discussion never really made it into the magazine itself. This made them think that they should make a game. Just talking about it wasn't enough anymore. Tajiri bought a computer with money he made from a mochi delivery job and did his best to learn programming. He started out making games similar to Space Invaders or Sega's Deep Scan, but he deeply felt that just copying wasn't enough. Originally, he'd wanted to make a game for the arcades, but when he saw Donkey Kong running on the Famicom, he realized that there was a chance for an actual business there. Game Freak's first game would be Quinty, or Mendel's Palace Overseas. Having grown up with the classics like Pac-Man, Dig Dug, and Xevious, Tajiri realized that each of these games seemed to focus on a central verb. For Pac-Man it was eat, Dig Dug dig, and Xevious shoot. He settled on flip, which would become the main verb for Quinty. Tajiri also once again showed his contrarian tendencies by making a game with a fixed screen, rather than a game featuring scrolling, which had become so common. Naturally, Sugimori was tasked with graphics for the game. Except making a game wasn't so straightforward. A contract to publish games for the Famicom cost tens of thousands of dollars, money which Tajiri and the Game Freak crew just did not have. By this time, Tajiri had already had enough experience being let down by others when it came to getting his game created, so he decided that they would make the game completely independently without a contract. After researching the Famicom and discovering that it had a similar processor, Tajiri went to Akihabara and bought an Apple II computer. Although they had the technology to make games, they still didn't understand the process, so progress was slow and it ended up taking years. During this time, many of the Game Freak staff wrote for other magazines, including Famitsu, Login, and Weekly Playboy, which is completely separate to the American version of Playboy. They used the money from these jobs to support Quinty's development, and they ended up moving from Sugimori's apartment to their first office in Shimokitazawa. Team Mystics from Aichi Prefecture actually assisted with the development of Quinty during this time, but eventually they graduated technical school and went on to find actual jobs at companies already established, like Namco. Tajiri was still driven to finish the game, and he would finish his day of working on magazines and then go to the headquarters in Shimokitazawa to continue work on the game. However, it was risky. They didn't have a contract at all, and they weren't even sure if they could sell it to a company, and further whether it would sell at all. Tajiri eventually asked the main programmer to quit his job writing for magazines and to start work on the game full-time. Tajiri would pay him a salary. And when it had been completed, Tajiri only really had one company that he wanted to sell it to, and that was Namco. In his mind, Quinty had been born from playing the Namco classics like Pac-Man, Dig Dug, and Xevious. The game was almost an homage to them. Tajiri had a contact at Namco through his work for the various gaming magazines, and through him was able to establish a meeting. Tajiri didn't realize it at the time, but Namco was one of the only companies with a contract with Nintendo that stated it was allowed to publish as many games as it wanted in a year. Other companies were limited to 3 games a year, as a means of encouraging quality over quantity. It was a good idea taking the game to Namco, and it was well received. Tajiri recalls how relaxed the whole thing was. It was around 5 PM when he went to show them the game, and the Namco staff that was still there were called upon for their opinion. They most liked the unique way in which the characters moved and were animated. Looking back on it, Tajiri says he realizes how crazy it was to have made the game first without a contract, and only then take it to companies to showcase. But at the time, he had felt that that would be the most persuasive way. Although they had completed the game, it would still take a few months to polish. They worked on improving the animations even further, and when it was ready, Namco allotted 200,000 units to be sold. This meant that Game Freak received around $500,000. This money posed a hard question for Tajiri. They could just split up the money, and that would be the end of it. But Tajiri wanted to continue making a living creating video games. The others agreed, and it was at this time that Tajiri realized that Game Freak would have to be established as an actual company. Tajiri didn't face any resistance to the idea of starting an actual company. The other members had already been calling Tajiri Shacho for some time, which is the Japanese word for the president of a company. And Tajiri was always one to take the initiative, having attracted the others with his dream of making video games. At first, there were about 6 members of Game Freak. Sugimori Ken wasn't actually an official member to begin with. For years he had been tossing up between following his dream of becoming a manga artist or having a career in video games. Tajiri agreed that he shouldn't feel rushed to become an official employee. They needed 7 staff members to register the company. About 3 became actual employees, and they filled the rest of the numbers with freelancers. Eventually the team grew to about 10 total members. Game Freak would begin work on game number 2. Capsule Monsters. This time, they did up a proper design document, and through Itoi Shigesato, were able to pitch the idea to Nintendo, who liked it. However, development would take even longer than Quinty's did, and Game Freak found themselves making other games in the meantime to keep the company going. So they had made their first game entirely independently, which came with its own struggles, but it had also allowed them to go at their own pace. Now that Game Freak was a company with contracts, they were restricted by time and money. If they didn't finish the games within the agreed timeline, it started to eat into their own profits. This period, when Game Freak was working on multiple games for other companies in parallel, was when the company's future seemed most bleak. Tajiri recalls arguing with a programmer for Jelly Boy, Smart Ball overseas. The programmer wanted more realistic physics, but Tajiri was more concerned with whether or not the game felt fun. He began to not even care if the game was finished because of this tension with the programmer. And it was during this period that Tajiri found himself in a transitional state between amateur and professional. He had deadlines to meet and wages to pay. For him it was fine. He had passion, so he didn't need to eat. However, he had the responsibilities that come with staff. The stress built up, and he went to see Ishihara of Ape. Jelly Boy was not yet completed. Magical Tararu Tokun was nearing completion, but Pokemon wasn't even on the horizon. At the time, Gunpei Yokoi, designer of the Game Boy, floated the idea of creating the same quality games for both the Famicom and the Game Boy. Hearing Tajiri's predicament, Ishihara strongly recommended him to Yokoi, believing that he was up to the task. Game Freak would focus on one idea for 6 months and make it for both the Famicom and the Game Boy. Tajiri agreed. This was such a critical, perilous moment for Game Freak that they stopped their work on all other games and threw their full force into Yoshi's Egg, known as Yoshi in the West. And they managed to do it. They completed both versions of Yoshi's Egg, and it ended up selling more than the other games they were working on in parallel. To Tajiri, the game was just homework that he had to do to make the games that he really wanted to make. But this style of working had saved Game Freak from going under. After this, Game Freak also went on to complete Mario and Wario for the Super Famicom in 1993, and also Nontan Toisho for the Game Boy and Super Famicom in 1994. 1994 also saw the release of Pulseman for the Sega Mega Drive. Pulseman was a character that Sugimori and Tajiri had purposely made in opposition to Sonic the Hedgehog. If Sonic was faster than sound, then Pulseman would be faster than electricity. If Sonic was blue, well then Pulseman would be red. They also simply wanted a cool character to show off at a gamers event, Tokyo Gamers Groove Night, which was run by Sato Dai, later known for Cowboy Bebop and Standalone Complex. So things were going pretty well, but there were still some low points. At one point, during Yoshi's development, half the staff quit. Sugimori came into the office one day to find their resignation letters on their desks. This is something that I find is often said was over wages or burnout, but Tajiri and Sugimori spell it out pretty clearly in the book. They quit because one of the women on the staff had relations with multiple other staff members, which caused infighting. Tajiri was looking to have her leave, but many of the staff members took the stance that if she were made to leave, they would too. Sugimori even says that he was initially against Tajiri on this point, but after a vicious argument where he said some horrible things to Tajiri, he did some self-reflecting and distanced himself from the group. Because of this, those staff members that were anti-Tajiri started to see Sugimori as on his side. And so, when Sugimori came in to find the letters of resignation, he was blindsided. They hadn't even discussed their intent to quit with him. So many staff members leaving at once caused Tajiri much grief, but after discussing it with Chunsoft's Nakamura, Tajiri realized that these things are bound to happen once you start employing more people. Sugimori is very regretful about his actions during this time, even going as far as to say without Tajiri he would have likely just died somewhere, likening it to the regret he feels towards the way he treated his parents. It was around this time that Sugimori decided to stop pursuing a career in manga and become a fully fledged Game Freak employee. He wanted to support Tajiri to the end, even if others would not. These kinds of experience shaped Tajiri and Game Freak from a ragtag group of game lovers into a functioning, established company. Tajiri even mentions early on not getting up to go to meetings because getting up early wasn't a part of his job. Like I mentioned before, Game Freak started out as just a bunch of people who loved games gathering at Sugimori's apartment and hanging out and making the magazine. There weren't any rules or formal company structure to begin with. Tajiri says that this kind of culture was okay for those who were there from the start, but he found it difficult to explain to newcomers. Tajiri looked at other video game companies to see how they did things, and started to establish some of their best practices. And he started wearing suits, like Chunsoft's Nakamura, which caused Itoi Shigesato to ask them why. He thought it was weird. Itoi Shigesato does not wear suits himself, despite being the head of his company, so he found it strange that Tajiri and Nakamura were. This transitional period for Tajiri and Game Freak was strongest around 1993, around the time of Mario and Wario. But finally, after coming through fire and flames, Game Freak was able to focus their full attention on Pocket Monsters. Tajiri says the idea came from thinking about his childhood, from remembering that he was obsessed with something before video games. He says that it wasn't a conscious nostalgia for the time, but rather just the idea that humans could have monsters in little capsules that they could call upon when they needed to fly, swim, or fight. Creatures that could be partners to humans. Tajiri wanted each creature to have its own personality, but the Game Boy hardware wasn't up to the task, so the Pokédex was born, featuring descriptions of their personalities and characteristics. When he first took the idea of Pocket Monsters to Nintendo, around the height of Tetris's boom, he estimated that around 3 to 4 people could complete it in a year, for $150,000. In retrospect, he laughs at that very optimistic estimate. The idea for Pokemon came about around the same time as Quinty's development, and was eventually released around 6 years later in 1996. In the book, they generally reference Pokemon's development period as being around 5 years, and so Pokemon was unique in the aspect that its development spanned a period encompassing the early amateur days of Game Freak right through to when they had, as Tajiri put it, started to be professionals. Tajiri says that even though he is like the embodiment of an arcade delinquent, having grown up on a diet of Space Invaders and Xevious, he had begun to feel the limitation of action games. At the time, if you had asked people if they were interested in games, they would generally respond with something like, well, they're too fast, or they're too difficult, or they end pretty quickly. Tajiri wanted to overcome this, and more than make a game for children, he wanted to make a game for everyone. Tajiri wanted to make a game that you could even show to an old lady and have her be interested. As you know, Pocket Monsters was a massive success. Tajiri says that he wasn't actually surprised with the success of the game. He only started to be surprised once they had passed 10 million units sold. What he says he is interested in is how the games are viewed overseas. He was aware that both the Dragon Quest and Mother series weren't that popular overseas. He remarks that the Dragon Quest series borrows a lot of Western ideas of dragons and knights, and that Mother 1 and 2 borrow much from the view of America that Japan got through Steven Spielberg and Tim Burton films. Tajiri says that he consciously made something Japanese feeling, not in the way that a ninja game would appeal to a Westerner's exotic view of Japan, but simply something that was more true to his own origins. He says that a lot of what is in the first Pocket Monsters game is because he would recount a childhood memory, and other Game Freak staff would say that they had had a similar experience. He suggests that it is perhaps this that made it resonate with people overseas. In the early days of development, people told him that a game like that will never be completed, and that he should focus his efforts elsewhere. In the final days of development, people would question why they were releasing a game for the Game Boy, which had started to be seen as old technology. Tajiri was affected by comments like this. He was proud, and he says that his strong desire to make a game that would change the world continued right up until Pokemon's release. He says that something like Pocket Monsters couldn't have been created if it were just work. And remember, all through this time, Tajiri was dealing with staff problems, money problems, and trying to figure out how to complete multiple games at the same time. I found it very surprising that what Tajiri said gave him the motivation and inspiration to keep going during this time was the lives of film directors like David Lynch. They even likened Pokemon's development to Eraserhead's production, as both took 5 years and both had their setbacks. However, the name that keeps coming up in this book is John Waters. Funnily enough, Tajiri Satoshi is a massive John Waters fan and goes as far as to call John Waters' book Shock Value his Bible. This is a book that contains such lines as, "Once I saw bloodstains on the seats, and this I still treasure as my happiest childhood memory." Or, "All people look better under arrest. The ugliest criminal and the motliest junkie take on a special glamour as they are handcuffed and dragged before the crime-hungry American public." Tajiri first saw John Waters' Pink Flamingos after going to see a showing of the 1932 film Freaks. It's not suggested anywhere in the book, but I do wonder if this is where the idea for the name Game Freak came from. Anyhow, after Freaks they showed Pink Flamingos, and Tajiri was shocked. He watched it thinking that it was a documentary on life in America. The film made such an impression on Tajiri that during his trip to America to find a local publisher for Quinty, he made sure to go to multiple shops just to secure a copy of Pink Flamingos on VHS. Sugimori even mentions that while he mostly watches anime, Tajiri would put on things like Pink Flamingos while they worked, and Sugimori would just be absolutely baffled as to what it was they were watching. Which means that during Pokemon's development, there is a greater than zero chance that Tajiri Satoshi was trolling Sugimori Ken with such great scenes as the singing butthole while they worked on the game. I just thought I would note that. As strange as it seems, Tajiri Satoshi is very inspired by John Waters. Tajiri's trip around America trying to find a local publisher is even reminiscent of John Waters' tales of driving around America trying to sell his films. Tajiri sympathizes with the innuendo in the name John Waters, as the name Tajiri contains a Japanese character for butt. If you read the name literally, it could be read as field butt. He says that the enemies in Quinty are humans and not monsters because he was inspired by this idea of shocking people to make them laugh. But one concept that Tajiri keeps bringing up in the book is suburbia. I think that in Tajiri's mind, John Waters' Baltimore and Tajiri Satoshi's Machida are linked. It sounds crazy to say, but I think that Tajiri Satoshi meant for the first Pocket Monsters game to portray Japanese suburbia in his own way. But it also makes sense because when you read the book, you really get an idea for what influenced Tajiri. He brings up Aoyama Masaki's zine, Totozen Henyi, or Sudden Mutation, as a great influence on him. He cites it as making him want to write articles like that in the future. I can't even mention the kinds of things that zine goes into here, so just think edgy, think unspeakable. And throughout the interview, Tajiri and Miya Shotaro discuss an incredible breadth of environmental and societal issues, such as the oil crises of the 70s and 80s, snuff films, and Miyazaki Tsutomu, also known as the otaku murderer. Tajiri himself notes that he has often dealt with the label of otaku. They comment on the Aum Shinrikyo incident, and Tajiri mentions how that the cult had a local bento store that he actually had ordered from once during a night where Sugimori and him were discussing game ideas. The cult member rocked up on a bicycle, and the boxes that the food were in featured a smiling sticker of the cult leader. This was, of course, before the sarin gas attacks. So to put this all shortly, I just don't think that the freak in Game Freak is there without meaning. Tajiri Satoshi is into some pretty out there stuff. He comments that his darker hobbies haven't gone away, he's just learned to hide them better, which in a way I think is kind of sad. In the book, the interviewer Miya Shotaro comments that Tajiri is originally a writer with something to say. Tajiri was inspired by an underground zine, writing reports fanatically in school, going on to make his own zine about video games, and constantly writing articles for the major gaming magazines, and even publishing his own book, Catcher in Pac-Land, about his personal experiences in the arcades. All of this before Pokemon, before 1996. I get the feeling that after Pokemon, Tajiri found himself in the position where he can't really write or say all of the things that he would have. In the book, the interviewer remarks, and Tajiri agrees, that the first Pocket Monsters game was probably the last thing Game Freak made where there was a rich communication during the development process. It was the last thing that Tajiri was able to be involved in every little part of. After that, the company became bigger, and Tajiri would find himself asking, who made this bit? And then, seemingly in no time, the game was complete. During the interview, Tajiri and Sugimori both indicate that they are tired from the sheer scale of Pokemon. Sugimori finds himself looking at other video game franchises like Dragon Quest, and he doesn't like the idea of having to keep up with that. At the same time, Tajiri says on multiple occasions that he views companies as a way to facilitate the continuation and protection of the worldview of Pokemon and also his employees' livelihoods. As the game is quite autobiographical, he feels a deep responsibility to both those that helped him make the game and also all the fans. So after having read this book, I feel like it shed a lot of light on some things for me. Certainly, I feel like I have a better idea of what kind of person Tajiri Satoshi is now. I'm surprised to have found that he's more business-minded than I would have thought he was, and that he has some really underground roots. But it also explained to me why the later generations of the games just don't have the same feeling. The first Pocket Monsters game seems to have been something that was entirely personal to Tajiri and the team who made it. The behemoth franchise that it morphed into later is a completely separate beast. This is just obscured by the fact that it shares the same name of Pokemon. The thing that surprised me most though, and you probably won't believe it unless you read the book, is this. Tajiri Satoshi grew up in the outskirts of Tokyo, in its appendix, in a little town called Machida. He witnessed a sudden change and grew up alongside the birth of the highest grossing entertainment industry. He then went on to create the highest grossing franchise of all time within that industry. But before all that, Pokemon was counterculture, and so was Tajiri Satoshi. Thank you for watching, and if you can read Japanese, I highly recommend you check out this book. It actually contains a whole bunch of little bits and pieces that I could just not fit into this video, so it's still a great read for any Pokemon fan. I'm planning to make more videos, so let me know if there's any untranslated Japanese books that you think I should cover. I have some ideas for the next ones, but I'm always open to suggestions. And if you'd like to help the channel grow, please leave a like, a comment, and subscribe. It's free, and it helps more than you can imagine. Thanks. See you next time.